Just a quick couple of notes before this video begins. You'll notice that the sound quality has been rather reduced on this one. It's because there's a hiss that was recorded somewhere. I don't know where, through whose microphone, but on removing the audio it kind of caused my sound to be rather webcammy and not the best quality that we usually get from this microphone. So sorry about that, but it is also quite a longer video. That's because it was streamed live on mine and Steve's channel, and it was all relevant, so there wasn't really much I could do to break it up and not break the flow. And lastly, I'll just say I do look away from the camera every now and then and laugh, and that's because I'm reading the comments and the questions from Steve's live chat, which I was looking at while we were going ahead, so I wasn't laughing arbitrarily at anything Jan and Steve were saying. As I say, it is quite a bit longer. It's about 2 hours, but it's certainly worth it if you can do it in more than one sitting or all together. Hope you enjoy it.
Okay, so I'm gonna start my stream here.
Sure.
Like I said, Darren, when I say live, that means I'm live into my stream. I'm gonna let you kind of just take it all over and run with it, because you got this covered. But I look forward to asking some questions as well and having a nice civil discussion about this. And I appreciate Dr. Holden a chance to come in and talk.
Yeah, no worries. I'm also in your chat, Steve, having a look. So if any questions come up, then I'll be able to see them both on your stream and on mine. Although probably much more on yours due to the size difference between our channels. Right.
Darren, can I rely on you to convey questions to me, or would you like me to open my chat and monitor that as well?
No, I can certainly relay. That's not a problem, and I'm sure Steve will as well.
I watch my chat
with this.
That sounds great.
So I'm now live on my channel as well, at least I should be if all the technology's working. You can see Jan's face moving, which is always a good sign. So
yeah, I'm going to go live. I'm ready to go live on my channel.
Sure. As soon as you're ready, let me know.
Okay, 3, 2, 1, and live.
Hello, hello. Welcome to everybody in Steve's chat and Steve's video. I'm also live on mine. This is I'm Darren. My kind of podcast / research program, if you want to call it that, is called Seeking Eye. It's started for my own kind of benefit, to learn what I can about the subjects of life after death. That's originally how it started, which came about through depression and anxiety, which caused me a huge fear of death. Just a minute, I need to mute yours because I'm getting my voice twice in the ear. That's very off-putting. And yeah, the fear of death kind of put me into this kind of area through depression, and I've had the lovely opportunity of speaking with Jan, as well as many other researchers in the field, and I've learned a hell of a lot over the past 2 years. I started off as kind of, I wouldn't say it's an atheist, am I, Jan? Would you say more an agnostic on the idea?
That would be a different video altogether.
Yeah, that's a completely different video. But kind of, I always believed that there was no such thing as life after death. Consciousness comes from the brain, and once you die, that's it, lights out forever. And I am someone that is pretty difficult to convince, but the research I've done has managed to do that, at least to a certain level. Always keep an open mind. But Jan is, in my opinion, now I always class you as a friend, Jan. I don't know if you class me as the same.
Absolutely, Darren.
And Jan is, in my opinion, probably the world's leading researcher in the near-death experience, alongside probably Bruce Grayson.
Yeah, currently, I count Bruce as number one, but yeah, you would, it's nice of you to say.
Jan's currently the president of the International Association of Near-Death Studies, which I'll let Jan talk about what that is, as well as are you currently the editor of the Journal of Near-Death Studies, or the past?
That's right.
Currently the editor. Yeah. So if I pass everybody over to Jan, if you want to go and talk about who you are and what you do and what the IANS group does.
Okay, great. In 1988, I completed my doctoral degree in counseling and took a faculty position at the University of North Texas, where I was on faculty for 31 years until this past fall, when I retired from the university. And during those years, my research focus was near-death experiences and related experiences, because, as we'll undoubtedly get into here, near-death experiences contain a lot of experiences that occur also under other circumstances, not just close brushes with death. And so in the course of that time, of course, I did a lot of studies and published a lot and so forth, but I also became associated with the International Association for Near-Death Studies. That's where in their refereed journal, I published my dissertation study, and over the years published occasionally in that journal. And then about 15 years ago, the founding editor, Bruce Grayson, who Darren was just mentioning, and I consider absolutely the #1 researcher on NDEs, had been the editor for 20 years. And so he asked me if I would take over editorship. So I've been editing that refereed scholarly journal for the past many years. The International Association for Near-Death Studies, to kind of step back to a broader picture, was founded in 1981. And I should say that the field of near-death studies formally opened in 1975 with Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life. And in that book, he coined the term near-death experience and really introduced the phenomenon to the population at large and most professionals as well. And it was the culmination of that during the 20th century, resuscitation techniques had gotten so good that people were being brought back from the brink of death in unprecedented numbers. And because of this, a lot more people were having near-death experiences, which is not the same as surviving a close brush with death. We'll probably get into that here in a minute. Actually, these phenomena have been recorded throughout history and across cultures, and even reported in scholarly journals previously, but nobody had like a name for them. And so it never really like coalesced into a focused area of study until Moody's book in 75. And then in 1981, Moody and Bruce Grayson and a few other people founded the association. And the original primary purpose was to support research because the scholarly academia was, generally speaking, pretty prejudiced and biased against research into this area because these are experiences that can't be directly observed, and so they're, not the kind of thing that that materialist scientists are wanting to focus on. So Bruce and Raymond and a few other people saw the need for an association where researchers could collaborate and produce a scholarly journal. And then the association quickly expanded, I guess I would say, into a second and third mission, the second one being education to disseminate the results of research, and the third being support for people who had had near-death experiences and people who work with near-death experiencers like medical professionals and mental health professionals. So we have researchers, experiencers, and professionals who have some interest in the experience. And then, of course, just the general public who is tends to be pretty interested in the phenomenon too. So that's a quick. Do you have any questions about the association? It's the if you're interested, you can go to the website at www.iands.org. IANDS, International Association for Near-Death Studies.
Steve, if we can kind of rely on you to have a look at the questions that come through. Because
I'll be paying attention to my live chat here.
I mean, anyone that's wondering why my eyes keep darting up like this, I've got Steve's chat up in the corner, so I'm keeping an eye on questions.
No questions so far, just basically, this is super interesting.
It is interesting, yeah. It is very interesting. Especially, I mean, you need really an open mind to really question this kind of stuff because it does go against, I mean, some of the conclusions, or the majority of the conclusions that the researchers draw do seem to go against what we believe to be the foundation of reality, and it does require an open mind to really look into this stuff. It might be worth if we give a brief definition of what the near-death experience is. When most people think of a near-death experience, as you say, there is a difference between, I mean, it's a matter of definitions, but technically you could say a near-death experience is simply a close brush with death, which, yes, that's one way, but that's not what exactly we're talking about. What we're talking about is a series of conscious experiences that take place. It may not even be when we are in direct contact with death. It could be through a fear of being close to death, but the experiences are essentially very, very similar, and they include often, but not always, a tunnel, a feeling of travelling down a tunnel, a bright light which seems to have some kind of personality and some kind of drawing vibration to it, if you want to use that word. I don't like that word, but you can use that word. Deceased relatives or individuals that people see. You could see religious or spiritual idols. Many people report seeing Jesus, at least in the Western world, but others do see figures based on their culture. And a variety of other, I mean, there could be as many descriptions of a near-death experience as there are people, because everybody is slightly different, although there are very similar foundations. And I'm pretty sure that's culturally based. I think Jan has a very similar idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, yes, that the way that I think about near-death experiences is that of all the people who survive a close brush with death, about 90%, 80 to 90% won't remember anything unusual. If they lost consciousness, it was just lights out until they regained consciousness, and nothing particular. But 10 to 20% of people report this, as Darren said, this experience of their consciousness functioning apart from their physical body. And I usually think of the NDE as having three aspects. One is a sense of absolute peace, which sometimes precedes the onset of the other two aspects. And then there's a material aspect. I call it the material aspect because the person's consciousness, they experience it outside their physical body, but observing the material world. And usually, my hands are up here because usually their consciousness is above their body, looking down on the vicinity of their physical body. But it doesn't have to be just that area. Many people in their NDEs have the experience of leaving the area, the vicinity of their physical body, and going to other locations in the material world. And there's a lot more to say about the material aspect of the experience, but the other big aspect is the non-material aspect, or transmaterial. I prefer the transmaterial because it's like beyond the material world. And there, as Darren said, the person experiences possibly moving rapidly through space, perhaps through a tunnel or some other sense of enclosure, but not necessarily. They could feel like they're moving rapidly through the stars. And then encountering entities and environments that are not of the material world. So they may be deceased loved ones, spiritual entities, religious entities. The difference between those being religious are associated with a clear religion like Jesus, for example, and spiritual is more not associated with some particular religious belief. And then environments like some people report Earth-like environments, but that have these vivid colors. There could be beautiful music playing. Every blade of grass has its own consciousness, and things that just don't entirely make sense to us here. So so that is a good overview.
It is. I think one point that I'd make, mainly about my own kind of interest in this, I'm sure you share the same kind of view, is that the experiences that contain a purely transient aspect, which is that they have all these visions, they see this landscape and they come back, those aren't of particular interest to me on and by themselves. I mean, they're interested in the fact that there are distinct similarities, but they don't provide really, to me, any kind of strong evidential value, whereas the ones that do interest me are the ones, as you say, that contain veridical material perception, especially in situations where all modern neuroscience, neurochemistry, neurophysiology, whatever you want to say, tells us that there should be no conscious experience under any circumstances. Right. They're the ones that really pique my interest, because that shouldn't really happen. And yet it appears to. We've had a couple of questions. If I can jump in there and ask away, let me just go back. Mainly it's regarding the cause of the near-death experience, which I imagine we'll get into. An intrigued feline asks, well, I do have one question. From what I gathered, one of the hypotheses is that there is just an overload of brain activity. How would this actually work in a body that essentially is dead? Yeah, see, that's one of the questions. How the hell can it happen? But it seems to
good question.
Very good question. That's kind of the base of the near-death experience research. But we'll kind of get into that sort of area of the cause. Another one from Exploratory Minds Project asks, another common but good one. My question is that according to what I've read on this, there is often a large release of DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, in the brain with this experience. Has this been looked at in your research? I'm not sure on this one if I'm right, Jan, but from what I've seen, it seems that DMT theory, that the brain releases a huge amount of DMT at death, which may cause hallucinatory visions like this, seems to be a bit of a myth or an overstated kind of fact. As far as I'm aware, the evidence to suggest that is not as strong as people tend to imagine it is.
No, that's right. I don't believe that anyone has ever actually measured DMT being released at death in the brain. So it's a hypothesis, but not one that, to my knowledge so far, has support. Now, there has been research comparing near-death experiences and DMT experiences, and there are some similarities, but there also are some important differences. For example, in DMT experiences, it's common for people to see circus imagery and also to see, to encounter aliens. And neither of those, I don't think I've ever heard a near-death experience that involved circus imagery or encountering aliens. So there's some similarity, but some important difference as well.
Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I if I could touch on that for a second, would that be okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the things about the near-death experiences, and by the way, I do find it a very fascinating subject as somebody who is a lucid dreamer all my life. And I do use the term lucid rather than out-of-body experience. I think they're completely the same thing, only expressed differently from a different vantage point. I don't believe they're external. I do believe that they're internal. However, I do know that they do exist because I've experienced them all my life.
They're certainly an experience.
But these are subject. Yeah, but these are very things that are very, very subjective, right? Obviously, as Dr. Holden pointed out, it is very difficult to measure, quantify, and compare subjective experience because we have our own sense data, and that sense data is not transportable. You can't just step into somebody else's mind and experience what they've experienced. So we look for commonalities, and this is why experts have said, yes, lucid dreaming is a real phenomenon. Why? Because there have been overwhelming people that have experienced with very similar stories about it, right? And I think that near-death experience can be approached the exact same way. But when it comes to the DMT things, I find it very interesting, and I'm going to step into my philosophical realm for 1 minute here. There's different ways of interpreting why there's a commonality between experiences, especially with DMT. One of them is called neurotheological reductionism, and that just basically is people experience very similar things because of brain chemistry. Okay, so it's a hardwired effect, and so we're all biological entities. We're all going to experience things very similarly. Near-death experience might be very similar to that. And then there's also what's called a contextualist, where our imagery is based upon our culture. And so you have said something about the circus, right, which is mechanistic elves and that kind of imagery. That could be strictly a cultural type thing. And then there's also what's called a literalist, which basically is, hey, these are actually really living entities people are having conversations with. In this case, the NDE would be a literalist position that there is something mind independent of the body. Correct? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly nobody doubts that there is a lot of culture involved with these experiences.
Yeah. In fact, if I could jump in and say something, that when I give a NDE 101 talk, basics about near-death experiences, I talk about NDEs having 3 levels. And at the deepest level, there are some universal features. So, and when I say universal, I don't mean that these features necessarily happen in every single experience, but they're very common in experiences.
Kind of the foundational experience of the near-death experience.
Kind of like foundational, yeah. And as Darren said, the presence of light, the experience of overwhelming love, the experience of profound peace, the experience of encountering entities that are not of the physical world.
Yeah.
And even the experience of perceiving the material world from a position outside the body. So these are things that really have been found cross-culturally. And one researcher who has looked into this is Jeff Long, who is one of the webmasters for the Near Death Experience Research Foundation. And at that website, which is www.nderffoundation.org, people from all over the world have registered their near-death experiences there. So he's really had an opportunity to compare cross-culturally near-death experiences, and he has a lot translated from other languages and that sort of thing. And so we know that there are these kind of very common fundamental features of experiences. Then at the next level, there's the cultural overlay. And that is that, as Darren said, Christians are more likely to see Jesus, and Buddhists might be more likely to see Buddha. Although there are cases where people have many cases in which people have seen entities that they didn't even recognize, but later figured out, oh, that was Buddha or something like that. And people have a lot of the experience is very surprising to people. It contradicts their expectations. So although there is a culture, and also people say that what they experience in their NDEs is that their phenomenology, their processing is different than it is when they're in the physical body. So they're taking an experience that they're trying to put into English or their native language, which, language was developed to navigate this reality, not some other state of consciousness. And so the only words that people have to describe what they've experienced are the words that come from their culture. So culture may influence how the experience unfolds to some degree. It may influence how people can even explain the experience. So it's inescapable that culture is going to be a factor. But the fact that there are these commonalities across cultures and throughout history indicates that there is something deeper than culture going on. And it's not to negate the presence of cultural influence. It's to say it's an and thing. There is this deep thing and there's this cultural level. And then there's a third level, which is individual, in that I've never heard 2 near-death experiences that were exactly the same. And many people's experiences contain elements that I've never heard in another experience. And so it's just good to be aware that every experience is going to reflect these 3 levels to some degree: the fundamental level, or the kind of universal level, the cultural level, and then the individual level.
I'd raise a question there, Jan, just about the fundamentals, that everything is the same generally at the base, or at least very similar and shared across cultures through many years. could you not raise the point? And I think Deep Ashtray has kind of nailed it there, saying that personally he's concluded it's concluded it's all about how the brain's wired. Is he? You can't even assume that sort of thing these days, can you?
Yeah, but I know my audience.
Yeah, I don't. That's the problem. But he's right. Then could we not say that the similarities are to be expected because generally the human brain is wired exactly the same way throughout the species, and so we will find commonalities as opposed to it's an ontological base.
I think that's it's a really good point, and also that once again, because the brain is wired, it's it's got its own hard wiring. Many near-death experiencers say that they experienced a lot of things in the NDE that they even knew that they were not able to bring back because we just can't conceptualize them with our limited, brains. And so absolutely that may be a factor in the existence of different aspects, the way those aspects are described. And I don't think that as long as we're alive, we're going to escape the possibility or the limitations, that that this is related to the brain. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a very good way to put it is trying to relate a dream to somebody. When you wake up, your dream starts being faded right off the bat. You don't remember most of your dreams. So even though you might have had something very profound in your dream, trying to relate to somebody would be very difficult. But I do find something very interesting that you mentioned earlier. Like one of the things in lucid dreaming, I have actually been in a state where I could actually lift my arms up, look at them, turn my hands around, look right through them, touch them together, have full tactile sensation, absolute full tactile sensation. But of course, my arms are laying down. I mean, now a property dualist or somebody who thinks that the mind-body separation exists, such that the mind can exist independently of a physical substrate, would probably say that there's some kind of out-of-body experience. Yeah. Now, I don't take that route. I do think it is, internalized. However, the experience is such that the evidence could go either way. There is no evidence that I don't think an experiment can be done where you can determine whether it is external, or internal, and you could try to determine if other minds exist, in any kind of real scientific way, or if reality exists in any kind of real scientific way. We have to make certain assumptions. So it's what you want to look at from your philosophical positions. However, the experiences are very real, and they are very, very convincing. I mean, to say, look, I'm not a metaphysical naturalist. I'm a methodological naturalist, but I got to say, when you have some kind of experience like that, it makes you pause.
It does.
It makes you pause. It is just something when you think to yourself, look, I can actually feel my fingers touching each other, and yet they're not. It's a weird sensation.
Yeah, it is. And there have been experiments done or studies done, especially with Sam Parnia in his AWARE study, but also by doctors such as Dr. Penny Sartori, who I know Jan will be familiar with, in which they've set up targets outside of the body. In other words, they haven't staple anything inside people, God forbid, but they've set up targets around the operating room during cardiac arrest or in wards that deal with that sort of thing, as an aim of, if someone comes out of their body, they should be able to see this target. All of them have failed at the moment, and they haven't yielded positive results, which generally is to be expected, because I think Sam Parnia had a study of, was it 2,000 or 4,000?
I don't know, but it was in the thousands.
And from that, one person had a material out-of-body experience that they were able to record and were well enough to be interviewed, and they didn't see the target. And people will often come to you, especially the skeptics will say, well, these experiments have never yielded positive results. You would need tens and tens of thousands of people to get a reasonable sample size of people that have had experiences, including material apparently non-physical veridical perception, in order to gauge, because if 2,000 or 4,000, I can't remember, people will yield one person who's able to be interviewed,
That has the presupposition, though, that they're able to, in their altered state, because regardless of what the verticality issue is, there's going to be an altered state of mind. And when let's say you're floating down a tunnel. I've taken trips to other planets in a lucid state, and you're traveling down a corridor, you're trying to read things, everything is altered in some capacity. You are, by definition, in an altered type of mind state. So I think the presupposition that you have a target, you're going to be able to get it correct, is just that. It's a presupposition. So to me, it doesn't have any evidence one way or other for any hypothesis.
Well, and there are a lot of cases, though, in which people reported perceiving things in the material world that were later verified to be accurate. And I know Darren interviewed a physician who had a patient who while the patient was in cardiac arrest.
Is this Dr. Chris Yerington? Sorry.
Yes, and they resuscitated the person. He of course survived, and then reported to Dr. Yerington that while he was out of his body, he was looking down on the scene in the operating room or wherever they were resuscitating him, and he, right in front of him, so to speak, were the inventory sticker on the lamp of the operating room. And it was, I think Chris said, or Yerington said, it was like 12 digits or something like that. And the guy reported to him and a nurse, and then back to him again. Every time they'd ask him, he'd say the same 12 digits. And so finally, curiosity got the better of them, and they went and checked, and it was correct. And there were some possible alternate explanations, but not very viable ones that I don't think. For example, at the beginning of the procedure where they're resuscitating, they turn the lamps upside down in order to do some, I don't know, sterilization or put something in. I don't know what it is. And so for about 30 seconds, he said, those stickers were facing, where the patient was lying like this. But they were in the process of resuscitating him. He couldn't remember, that is the doctor, whether he had already taped the patient's eyelids shut or not. And, because he wasn't trying to do a research study. He was trying to save this guy's life, and all this kind of unfolded after the fact. And so you can't entirely, but how, put yourself in that situation. If you're, in cardiac arrest and you're being resuscitated and your eyes flip open for 30 seconds and there's some kind of sticker on a lamp, that I'm sure was still a few feet away. How likely are you to remember those, to even think about that and, focus on that? But he said in the out-of-body state, he was there, he was watching for a long time, and he could report everything that had happened the entire time in the operating room. So he was seeing those stickers and really, thinking about them and concentrating. So all that to say that that's just one example.
Are you familiar with does the name Ed Dames, Major Ed Dames, ring a bell?
No.
Major Ed Dames, he and this is all supposedly, because he used to be on a a radio show by Art Bell called Coast to Coast.
Oh yeah, Art Bell.
Yeah, anecdotal. Yeah, he was supposedly what's called doing remote viewing in a project called Stargate Project. Claimed to be trained by Ingo Swann's protege. And so this is kind of what they were trying to do with the whole out of body type experience. It's very similar. They didn't necessarily call it that, but that's what basically remote viewing was, trying to get intel on enemy combatants and enemy intelligence that yielded no results whatsoever. But I think there was probably a lot of interest in a lot of these topics, especially in the 70s and 80s and during the Cold War, because any kind of psyop, anything advantage-wise we had to determine whether we can gain some military advantage, they looked into, and they didn't find anything useful. So there are always going to be anecdotal evidence that, hey, they had some kind of intel, they acted upon it, got maybe close. And in this case, like you said, that there's a number that they saw. But as somebody where to be saying that this is actually an actual event, there would have to be a lot more consistency there, to me, right? But again, we have to go into the presupposition that you're able to perceive things in a way that out of body, you wouldn't be having the same filters that we have, biologically speaking. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? You're trying to show something that is the case, that has verticality, but in order to do so, we have to, even have the presumption that you're able to do so in and out of body or a near-death type experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, and I've actually asked NDEers, people who've had the material aspect NDE, if they believe they could have read or did read, or could have read from that state. And a little over 50% said absolutely yes. And then some said, maybe, I'm not sure. And some said, I don't think so. But a little over 50% said they absolutely believe they could.
Yeah, words are generally distorted in those states. Like if you look in a mirror in an altered state, it looks altered. Words generally look altered. Yeah. And I think most people have had these kind of experiences say the same thing, that things don't look quite the same. They're slightly altered. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as Jan was saying about people that are out of body, when talking to them retrospectively, say they certainly could have seen things and could have reported back. And in Penny Sartori's study, what she was saying was she was one who put up targets to be viewed while the patients were out of body. And when she interviewed one of them later, and she asked, did you see this target? And the lady said no, but she said, to be honest, I was out of my body. I was freaking out a little bit because I was seeing myself dead down there. If I'd have known before I was going under that you'd set this up, I would have looked for it and let you know. But to be honest, looking around and finding things to remember wasn't really top of my list when I was out of body looking at myself dead. And you understand that,
Yeah, that's right.
And it's these kind of things. It's because
when you're in a lucid state, you're like going, hey, this is really cool. I don't know what the hell is going on here, but I'm just checking it out. You don't really have your wits about you to kind of go, okay, exactly what I want to do. But sometimes you do more than others. But then again, I've never had any. The closest I've ever had, I was doing a self-induced lucid state, and all of a sudden I felt like I was ripped out of my body, thrown on the floor, and I was looking up from my carpet, looking up at my TV. And this was years ago, back when I was, before I even joined the Navy, so this was my high school years. And, I snapped out of it, and I got out of my bed, got on the floor and looked up, and it was pretty much the same perspective. But that can be explained by just, your mind filling in these kind of blanks kind of stuff. But it was something that was very kind of, I was like, wow, this is cool.
That's one of the points one of your viewers brought up. I can't remember who it was. It's gone past. Oh, it was in Tree Fanny saying, isn't it also precisely how a brain's expected to work? It often fills in the blanks based on what one knows. If one doesn't know about these things in the ER, then it likely wouldn't create it. That's true, yeah. And this is why, these near-death experiences that don't contain a material veridical aspect don't particularly interest me, because I can reason myself quite easily into believing that it's a hypoxia-induced hallucination or a result of the drugs that are given. But when you have these experiences that take place with veridical perception in a time where every understanding we have in neurophysiology will say no experience is possible, that's when I begin to get interested, because then you have something that shouldn't happen.
Also when people perceive things that could not have been guessed. So, for example, in the book The Self Does Not Die, which is a collection of near-death experiences involving apparently non-physical veridical perception that was verified by at least one other person. In one case, a woman unexpectedly during surgery went into cardiac arrest, was resuscitated. They finished the surgery. During none of this did she ever regain consciousness or anything. So she's brought to post-op. She regains consciousness. Her physician comes to check on her, and she says, I know that I died during the surgery. And he's like, what? And she says, yeah, because I was up above the ceiling and looking down, and here's what you were doing. And he's kind of amazed, which, you know, he shouldn't be at this point. People should know this happens. But anyway, she says, yeah, and I also, because I was above the ceiling, I could see through the ceiling and I could see through the walls. I could see in the operating room next door that they were amputating a man's leg. And when they finished, they put the amputated leg in a yellow plastic bag. And I actually heard this physician interviewed online, and since then the interview has been taken down. But he said that he was like so surprised, like, what is she talking about? And he said he doesn't know what's going on in the other operating rooms. But at this point, it was a couple of hours later. So he went back to the hospital records and found that, in fact, while he was doing the surgery on her, they were amputating a man's leg in the operating room next door. And because it was a specialized operating room for those kinds of procedures, which wasn't what he did, he had never been in that OR before. But at that time, 2 hours later, it happened to be empty. So he went and peeked into the room, and there he saw the yellow plastic bags they used to dispose of amputated body parts. So it's like, how could a patient who's in cardiac arrest know what's going on in the next operating room, except that they did report accurately what was happening there, not something that they would have known, not something that their own surgeon knew. So that begins to more robustly challenge these alternative explanations that this is all, you know, the brain is filling in stuff, the person's hallucinating, you know.
The most common kind of or rebuttal that you hear for things like that is that, well, this is anecdotal. It doesn't have any kind of evidential value. To me, that doesn't work because these cases have been third-party verified and documented. I think as soon as you have third-party verification, and especially, as you say, the book The Self Does Not Die, which has hundreds, or I think over 100.
That's right, over 100 cases.
The English version, over 100 cases, all of which have been third-party verified, all of which contain these veridical perceptions. I think now you're kind of going beyond the realm of simple anecdotal.
Well, I think there's some value to have for anecdotal evidence sometimes. I think people are just too dismissive of it. Look, if you went to a crime scene and a bunch of witnesses are all saying, hey, you know, this person was wearing a blue T-shirt, 99% of them, if one person said they were wearing a white T-shirt, you know, the anecdotal evidence is probably going to be, through inductive reasoning, is going to be a suspect with a blue T-shirt. There's going to be some commonalities. So I don't think dismissing anecdotal evidence offhand is primarily the way to go. I would like to ask my audience, though, how many of them have had any kind of out-of-body or, again, I don't believe they're actually out of body, but lucid type dreaming or NDE or something like that, where, like, for example, like looking down from the ceiling. This has happened to me multiple times. I mean, I don't care if anybody believes me. I don't have to convince anybody. I'm not taking on any kind of burden of persuasion. Makes no difference to me whether they believe it or not. I know it has happened multiple times. I'm able to self-induce. I can help people do that. So, but does that mean that I'm actually out of my body? Well, I'm not convinced of that, right? I just am convinced of what I know to be the case, which I actually was. So it's a step-by-step process. So I think that because I have actually seen looking down, not necessarily at my body, but looking down from like the ceiling or something like that, then somebody else has as well. And how they fill it in, the blanks, or how they interpret it might be different. So I don't know whether they were, you know, out of their bodies. I don't know if they actually were looking at some kind of or but the possibility certainly arises merely from the fact that, yes, I've experienced very similar things, just not to that degree. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think many people will deny that these experiences happen. If they do, then I don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty silly position to take, to deny outright they don't happen.
Is it a real experience? Yes, it's a real experience, but what does that mean?
What's the cause? What is the causality of it? Sure.
I mean, we've got two possibilities, haven't we, really? It's either, or you could say many subsets, but generally it's either a brain-created experience, if you take the position that the brain creates consciousness, which I don't, but is a perfectly valid one. And the other possibility is that it's caused, perhaps even influenced by the brain, but ultimately it's kind of a separation that's taking place.
It really is. Is there something external that that exists
but,
there.
But yeah, exactly. Yeah. And either of those are perfectly valid positions to take. It's pushed so much now that the brain creates consciousness is kind of an understood thing. It's an assumption. It's nothing else, nothing other than that. There's a lot of evidence for it. There's also a lot of evidence now that the brain perhaps works as a receiver or something similar to that from an external force that we don't know, we don't understand. The question is which is more parsimonious, and it depends kind of on what you class as reasonable evidence and the way that you've been brought up, and it goes on a lot of factors. But to me, personally, not saying I'm right, it's much more parsimonious to say that the brain seems to act more as a filter, because you have all the evidence that you see for a materialist idea that the brain creates consciousness can also be used, plus more, in my opinion, on the brain receiver theory, because you can also now explain to a much wider degree these anomalous experiences and the veridical perception that takes place. How that would work, nobody knows. And if it is non-physical by definition, how are you going to know?
But that's the question, how to go about acquiring knowledge about this. So this is why I do like these kinds of studies. People always say, why do we have kind of paranormal kind of studies? And I think that word is awfully misused because of, unfortunately, bad actors. Do I believe the supernatural exists? No, I don't. Do I think it's possible? Yes. That's why I'm not an ontological or metaphysical naturalist. But I think that research into these areas absolutely should be done. I think that even if we don't garnish any information regarding supernatural causation or paranormal stuff, it still, I think, inherently leads to even at the worst case, some kind of naturalistic explanation.
Yeah. I think even that word paranormal is very misleading, because to me, when something's discovered, it will be natural. It's just that it hasn't been discovered yet. People always compare or separate paranormal or supernatural and undiscovered, unfound natural. To me, it's one and the same thing.
I don't categorize them that way, though. Yeah. And the reason being is because there is preternatural, which I think that's maybe what the term better would be used for that. But I think supernatural is more effective in a philosophical concept of things that are outside our experience. Like, for example, even if God existed, yes, he would be part of the physical world. He'd be part of this possible extant world that exists, the actualized world. But because he's so far removed from our experiences in any kind of real practical kind of way, that's what we mean, generally speaking, in philosophy, what a supernatural causation would be. Something that is so beyond the natural, even though that it exists in some capacity in this possible world, it is completely different from our normal experiences in every capacity, not just like an alien mind or something like that. And I think that's not a bad way to look at it if you're looking at a set theory.
Yeah, and that's fine. But does that mean that it's not part of nature, or is it a part of nature that we just simply don't understand yet?
Well, when we use the word nature, that we're kind of limiting the scope to things that we experience, right? If God, for example, if some kind of theistic type deity exists outside space-time, then that would be completely contrary to what we understand for any understanding we have of the universe, Minkowski space, even a kind of a Lorentzian model. So we say, hey, we're going to categorize this stuff to be so far removed, we're going to call it supernatural. And supernatural causations don't have to have any kind of naturalistic explanations, right? They don't have to say this caused this, because mechanisms which we may not be knowing of right now, but we have the ability to learn. Supernatural could be anything, right? I mean, magic would be supernatural, which has no actual ontology and explanations or anything. So my point is, I think Dr. Holden perfectly stated it earlier, we have to relate these things in words based upon our language and cultures. Yeah. And there's no way for us to linguistically kind of describe what supernatural would be other than something that is completely removed from our natural experiences, whether it exists in this possible world or not. To me, is not constitutive of something that is supernatural.
Well, I guess I want to take kind of a position in between, or maybe a little closer to Darren, in that I prefer the terms material and transmaterial. And I think what you're referring to, Steve, about what we can experience directly is the material world. We're capable of experiencing the material. I also have had transmaterial experiences. I have had an experience of an encounter with what I perceived to be God in a mystical experience. It was perfectly natural. It was perfectly natural. I don't know how else to say it. It was perfectly natural, but it was not material. It was not of the material world. And so I think for me, the words material and transmaterial more clearly help to differentiate. And in my view, both of them are part of nature. Everything is part of everything is natural.
Was this a type of theistic type God?
No, because I'm not theistically or certainly not religiously affiliated.
No,
I'm affiliated with my experiences and research.
So you would say that it was some kind of intelligence, but not of what people of a religious nature would be saying. Hey, this is the Christian God. This is the Arab God. But it's some entity that does exist that is and somehow involved in our daily routines, and somehow in the creation of all things, that kind of intelligence thing. In some way. Okay.
There's so many different theories about what one would call God. I mean, you got the religions that call a God a separate entity who is governing over and has a reward and punishment system, something I don't believe in at all. In that sense, I'm atheistic. Whether you could say I'm a theist because I believe in some sort of some intelligence beyond what we currently understand, I don't know, which is why I find I'm so difficult to label myself into one of these categories.
Well, you don't have to. I mean, a person doesn't have to. Look, you can believe supernatural exists and still be an atheist. They're not independent of each other. I mean, there are forms of atheism where, like, even in the International Encyclopedia of Philosophy, McRae writes that some people use atheism to mean materialistic, as Dr. Holden pointed out. But right, a materialist that has that's it. There's just by fiat, basically. If you're a materialist, you have to hold there are no gods or no spirits or no dualism. There is nothing really possible other than what we have physicality for.
Yeah.
And so that I don't think is a good definition. I don't think that actually works very well. But you could say, look, I don't believe in any gods, but I do believe there might be some kind of spiritual aspect of an intelligence that exists. I don't think those are mutually exclusive, and I don't think spiritualism is mutually exclusive from atheism, because we all had experiences that are, I believe, some of us call spiritual. That doesn't mean something supernatural exists or what you described as transmaterial. It just means, to me, when you have a spiritual experience, it is profound, it is emotional. Music to me is spiritual, right? I mean, you hear some songs, and I relate that as almost a spiritual experience, right? And I have no problem with that, but I think a lot of atheists discount those kind of terms right off the bat because they have so many religious overtones.
See, to me, and I've just done a podcast on this I haven't put up yet. It's effectively me just thinking out loud, but on the difference between religion and spirituality. To me, I would define religion as an organised group who base their lifestyles on morals and guidelines set by the founders of the religion, or at least the way that their words have been taken, and through the holy books, and they take their morality and they follow their life based on that. Whereas to me, spirituality is more living and just experiencing life without those boundaries and coming to your own kind of understandings based on just being alive. And
I think of similarly. I think of religion as social institutions, so that is created by humans, and often with reference to a spiritual domain. But the religion is essentially a social institution, and spirituality for me is about the direct experience of something that is beyond mere physical.
And usually these experiences kind of force you into a belief that these kind of experiences, maybe there are some kind of, if you want to say, paranormal aspect to it, because first-hand experience seems to trump everything else when it comes to learning. I just wanted to correct Marie-Jeanne Coucher who said to Deepak Trey that he'd be interested in the research by Paul van Lommel. It's Pim van Lommel, P-I-M. He's a Dutch cardiologist who wrote an account in the Lancet about non-local consciousness. But yeah, go and look at his work. He did some very interesting things. Might be worth, you think, going back to the near-death experience and looking at some of the sceptical arguments that are put forward to explain it in a materialistic fashion. The first one that most people jump to is anoxia, which is effectively lack of oxygen in the brain while the heart is not pumping. Jan, do you want to say much about that theory?
Yeah, just that there have been a couple of studies in which oxygen level has been assessed while people were being resuscitated from cardiac arrest, and they found that there was no relationship between the level of oxygen in the brain, in the bloodstream or in the body, and either the presence or absence of a near-death experience. So in other words, some people who had very low levels of oxygen, some of those had a near-death experience, some did not. And people who had relatively higher levels of oxygen, some had near-death experiences, some did not. So oxygen level had no relationship to the presence or absence of a near-death experience. It just wasn't related.
So no evident correlation there between oxygen level and the one that relates to that is the amount of CO2, isn't it, in the blood? Which there was a study done on that. I'm not overly familiar with it.
Same thing, yes. Both oxygen and carbon dioxide and other gases were being assessed. No relationship.
One study that is also widely cited is that of Olaf Blank, who stimulated, and it's well mentioned by Susan Blackmore, who's a well-known near-death experience critic or skeptic. And their experiment involved electrically stimulating a part of the brain called the temporal parietal junction, the TPJ, which they believe is responsible for kind of creating the mental image and sensation of being within the body. And they believe that stimulating that part of the brain effectively simulated an out-of-body experience adequately enough to say that the temporal parietal junction some way is involved in the manifestation of out-of-body experiences. So what's your take on that one, Doctor?
Well, two things. One is that, yes, I can open up your skull and take an electric prod and touch it and make your arm twitch, But that's not the same as you going, I know when I'm being, manipulated, when I haven't intentionally caused the thing versus when I cause it, and it feels different. But the other main thing is that all of the materialist explanations don't explain how there can be veridical perception, verified, seemingly non-physical, and things that people couldn't have, deduced or that sort of thing. So even if I think that the brain theory that makes the most sense to me was just addressed in an article in the most recent issue of the Journal of Near-Death Studies, where the authors, Marjorie Willicott and her co-author, whose name I'm blanking on right now, looked at research evidence related to psychedelic experiences and meditation. And in both cases, the DMN, which I'm now blanking on the what that acronym stands for, but it's a system within the brain that seems to be related to our sense of ourself. And when that goes offline, but which occurs both with psychedelics and with mystical experiences, but these are people who are still, very much in their bodies. But this system goes offline, and that's correlated with mystical-like experiences, both in meditation and in psychedelics. And what they suggested is that in near-death experiences, when the entire brain is offline, that would account for why near-death experiences have these mystical features as well.
I had to Google that, by the way. I'm fine with Google Foo. Default mode network, is that what you're thinking of?
Default mode network, thank you very much.
Okay. Google Foo for the win.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
I have not either. And I'm happy to admit when something I do not ever heard of before, I'm happy to look it up.
I'd also just like to apologise to Cheshire and anyone else that falls asleep because of my soft voice. I am very softly spoken.
You do have a very soft, pleasant voice.
Very soothing.
That's the therapist.
Yes, very soothing, correct. I wonder, have you ever had an angry discussion in any debate or discussion?
I try to avoid confrontation as much as possible. With the anxiety and the depression, it's my heart is very soft. And things are.
So let me ask.
Let me take this opportunity to say that I have never known someone as open-minded and willing to consider alternative perspectives as Darren. I just think that you are an exceptional human being in this regard. And you really, I've never seen you lose your temper or lose your sense of. I think you've become impatient and clearly disagree with a point of view, but you still maintain your openness and connectedness to people, and it's just laudable because I'm not that cool.
Well, yeah, my audience has never ever seen me lose my cool. Ever. No, wait. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I almost got that out with a straight face. Actually, I really broke character there because, I've been on way too long and have a lot of times lost my cool, to say the least. And it's usually out of frustration, though. It really is dealing with dishonest actors. I can disagree with somebody all I want. We can have diametrically opposing views, but when you're dealing with somebody who's not an honest interlocutor, that is being dishonest, disingenuous, evasive, it can get very frustrating, and I think that's. I think a lot of people will eventually go, "Okay, I've had enough there." But let me ask you this, Dr. Holden McCann, because one of the hardest problems I have with the philosophy of the mind is basically the problem, not just of hard consciousness, but the problem of having a materialistic or monistic type substance that, if you have a thought, if I have, I want you to do something, that is merely an abstract thought. And it is very difficult, even for a materialist, to say, how does that thought convey into a changing of something in the universe? It is manifested as a thought, but now that thought mechanistically has to be able to change something. Because if I say I want to, take a glass of, sip for my water here, I have that thought. How does it actually get changed into an actual action? And for a diehard materialist, that is one of the most difficult questions in the philosophy of mind, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
And by the way, like I said, I'm not a substance dualist. I'm all over the place on that, but it is one of the more difficult questions. And I'm fine when people say, "Look, we don't have an answer to that yet." Yeah, and that's I agree. We do not have an answer for it, but it is a very, very difficult for anybody who just says, "Hey, look, I'm a firm materialist." Okay, well, if you're a firm materialist, then how does the abstraction become concrete? There has to be a hyperstantiation there, and so. There's a materialist, how does that do that for materialists, right? They have to say magic, but then that defeats the position. I'm open-minded on that as well.
A lot of people on the skeptical side always bring forth the quote that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and yes, fair enough. What's a more extraordinary claim than material, non-conscious matter can create an experience? Actually,
what's funny? I literally recorded that's Sagan's statement, right? He didn't actually say it outright. It was actually he did, but he modified it by Leibniz and Truzio. But basically, I just recorded something for Agree to Argue on extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and why I think it's a very bad aphorism, and why both atheists and theists probably shouldn't use it. It is just a rule of thumb, but there's many problems on that. So I will plug my other channel real quick, which is not really my channel, but I'm on there with Dr. Fazrana. If you're looking for these kind of topics relating to me and a theist having these conversations, then go check out Agree to Argue, because we will have that video up soon. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Huh, that we do a little segment on. And I think that argument for ECRE I think it's bad. I think it's bad. I really do. And I think a lot of atheists just kind of dismiss things by fiat by saying extraordinary claims. But then when you kind of ask them, well, what do you mean by an extraordinary claim? You kind of find out claims are claims. Evidence is evidence. Anytime you kind of involve any kind of subjectivity into an objective scientific framework, you're going to have a problem because now you're not being objective. And so, I would disagree with you, Darren, on that ECRI is probably a model people should use. I think if people really looked into it more, they'd probably go, yeah, maybe we shouldn't use it as that much. But that's my side note for the day.
Sure. There was a question from a while ago that I tried to get in as soon as I could from Feline again. It was regarding the idea of the phantom limb phenomena, where an amputated limb can often be felt as if it was still there by the person and yet not. And it was, I believe the question was in relation to the Olaf Blanke idea of your brain effectively being able to create this sensation of being out of body or connected in some sort of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well explained, Darren.
I do. And I think it's a good possibility that there's some kind of relationship there, and that it is phantom, meaning not actual, and then for me that brings us back to the phenomenon of veridical perception, in which something seemingly non-physical actually is perceived accurately. So that it's possible that what Blanc was finding was something related to the phantom limb phenomenon. Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
It is. Deep Ashtray says, by the way, Deep, you mentioned about the quantum stuff with IP. I've had a chat with him. He's a good guy, knows what he's talking about. Go and watch that.
I like IP.
It might be an interesting one. He does his research. Jeez. He said, Deep Ashtray says, meditation has a lot to do with moving your thought process to a different part of the brain. Sorry, wrong one. The other one mentioned meditation as well. Here we go. What Darren said was saying about the lack of oxygen to the brain could be something in because in meditation you slow your heart rate right down, so it could be something in that.
Yeah, so, and I don't know whether anyone has actually measured oxygen levels during like if people have mystical experiences during meditation, for example. But I do know, going back to that other research, that there has been research on the default mode network being deactivated, that seemingly what people actually are training themselves to do unknowingly during meditation is to deactivate the default mode network. And whether there's any difference in oxygen level when the DMN is online or offline, I don't know, but the bottom line seems to be this kind of neural alteration.
The question then, of course, is that if you have the assumption that the brain is the producer of consciousness, you will use that as kind of, well, we see that this brain activity is reduced or heightened during this experience, so therefore this is where in the brain it takes place. And the question is the standard correlation causation question, because all any study of the brain and the activity can show is correlation at best. And the question is, yes, this part of the brain lights up, but that doesn't necessarily show that that's the causal factor.
Exactly.
And, I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. And especially if you consider the possibility that the brain is a filter, then it would equally make sense that part of the brain is operational or not operational related to this particular experience. But again, if the cause is C, not A, then I lost my train of thought. I do want to emphasize what you said though before, Darren, about I have found a lot of phenomena that can be explained by both the theory that the brain causes consciousness and the theory that the brain is a filter of consciousness, that consciousness actually has its origin outside the brain and is somehow filtered through the brain. So this is the same, when we're talking about electrostimulation of the brain, or just about, most of the phenomena that we know can be understood either through this or this equally well, and there's no basis to privilege one of those views over the other.
Yeah, that's right.
However, there's this category of phenomena that can be explained by the filter theory, that can't be explained by the brain produces consciousness theory. I have never found a phenomenon that could be explained by the brain produces consciousness theory that couldn't be explained by the filter theory. So you were talking before about parsimoniousness, and I also want to bring in comprehensiveness, that the brain produces consciousness is not as comprehensive an explanatory model as the filter model, and particularly in light of at least what so far for me has been a fact, that I don't know of a phenomenon that can be explained by the brain produces that can't be explained by the filter theory.
What would you place this one in then?
Pardon me?
Oh, I'm sorry. What would you place, for example, the phenomenon of, I tend to what's called color realism. I don't think colors actually have ontology at all. I think that there's purely a phenomenon that exists in the brain. Because, we can see colors when we sleep. So there's obviously nothing relating to any kind of joules or energy deposited on the retina. The brain's not processing anything. It's not has anything to do with photons or physics. It is a strictly phenomenological thing that exists solely within the mind. So the color that we experience, the actual experience, the qualia of the sense, and I think that you're right as far as a filter, but I would put it more as we are a biological entity that has been through millions of years of evolution to filtered to how we perceive our universe. If things had evolved differently, we'd perceive our universe in a very different way. And so what the actual state of affairs of the universe, we never have epistemic access to. I think it's completely forever outside of our understanding, and will always be, just because we have to work with the hardwire when we've got. So when we experience a color, and I do mean the actual phenomenon itself, which of those two theories you think better explain that? The brain produces a consciousness, or somehow the consciousness exists, and then the brain kind of filters that as a receiver of some kind?
Well, I think that it can be explained through either theory. One of the kind of interesting things from near-death experiences is it's very common for people to report that in the transmaterial domain in particular, they perceived color that doesn't exist in the material world, or that they at least never seen in the material world. And they also report hearing sounds that are different from anything they've ever experienced in the material world.
Yeah, so I think that's fascinating. That is really interesting, actually.
Yeah, and so that's it is really interesting. Like, how can we perceive something in an altered state of consciousness that exceeds anything we could have perceived in the physical world?
Yeah, well, the color pink doesn't even have a wavelength associated to it. The color pink isn't phenomenological, strictly, because it doesn't have any relationship to wavelength or anything like that. And I think that is indicative of, yes, we know the spectrum. We know that there are certain only quantized levels within the electromagnetic spectrum for visible light. However, we still see things that maybe don't necessarily exist in the electromagnetic spectrum. And I think to say that the brain is capable of doing that is a remarkable thing in and of itself, regardless of if it's... Yeah, it's just... and I'm fascinated by that stuff. I really am. I think it is worthy of exploration. It's definitely worth studying. I think a lot of people do kind of pass it off by fiat way too quickly. But I think if we can ever resolve some of these answers, it would just be amazing, not just for neuroscience, but philosophy as well, which is the kind of the area I like.
Just Deep Ashtray just quickly asked, what's the mechanism? Just could you clarify the mechanism for what? We've said many things. Yeah, and Macabre Malefica says, I demonstrated that by correcting an imbalance of glutamate in the nucleus accumbens,
that's right.
Abate compulsive drug-seeking behaviour. Where is the filter? This conversation requires a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
I can only bring a couple experts on at a time, Macabre. Come on.
Don't try and take credit for arranging this, Steve.
Yeah, actually, this was. By the way, I never even got to that. I want to thank Darren because Darren arranged all this stuff. I'll get into all that afterwards. But this was actually Darren's big thing, and it was in several months in the works actually. But go ahead, Dr. Holden. I apologize.
Well, I think that this is exactly. I think it exactly illustrates the possibility that of the filter, that if I change the nature of the filter, then I'm going to change the nature of what I experience.
Absolutely.
And so if I correct some kind of, quote, imbalance, which just means that it was functioning different than most people's does. I'm not sure that that's necessarily, it's like there's an inherent value judgment about that. But if I change the configuration somehow chemically and change the experience, I am changing the filter through which what at least what near-death experiencers report is that when during the near-death experience, their consciousness is expanded. They have capacities, perceptual capacities that they don't have in the physical world or in physical existence. And they really experience, when they re-enter the body, they experience those abilities getting, like diminished again so that they can fit back in. It's, like squeezing your foot into a shoe that's smaller. And they often, after their NDEs, have this sense of that their consciousness somehow is larger than it was before. So the point is that their perception is that the brain definitely is a filter that reduces what we actually are capable of perceiving. And for me, a big philosophical question is why? Why are we, if all of this is the case, why are we embodied in these limited bodies carrying out this, horrendous drama that involves a lot of suffering and all of that? Like, what's the point?
The end purpose? Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's another 50 videos just dedicated to that question.
Yeah.
Well,
I can tell you at least what near-death experiencers tend to say, and I'm not, not every NDEer is going to say this, but most will say that they learned in their NDE that we are here on Earth, although they don't explain ultimately why, that we're here to advance in our capacity to love and to learn. So it's all about loving and learning, and that somehow earthly existence is an opportunity to advance spiritually and bring lessons that we're able to learn only in these dimensions with us when we return, as NDEers would say, to the dimension from which we came. And so at least it provides an answer, whether you buy it or not is very much,
And I'll just say, Deep Ashtray did expand on his questions to the mechanism, and essentially it was what I thought you were saying is that what's the mechanism then for the if what we call God or consciousness exists? What's the mechanism for that existing? How does it exist outside of the physical brain? And the answer I can give you is that's why we're studying it. We don't know.
Yeah,
we haven't got a clue. Yeah. We don't pretend to.
No.
But that's the whole reason we're studying it. But the point is, the experiences that people have and the veridical aspect of it especially seems to indicate that there is something, at least. And I think it would be incredibly arrogant to say that we understand a tiny percentage of what existence really is. that there is something we don't understand beyond the physical brain. What that is, we don't know. How that interacts, we don't know. But it's worthy enough of investigation. And also, Macabre Malefica, comes back again on the idea. He says, but compulsive behaviour can be contextualised as a broken circuit between your hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. A broken memory, correcting glutamatergic dysregulation reduces compulsive behaviour.
Yeah, change the filter, change the output behaviour.
A good analogy for that is if we take one of the examples, very crude example of evidence used for a physical means. If you bash your head with a hammer, you're going to lose consciousness, or you're going to become incredibly fuzzy in your consciousness. If you play a radio, which we know by definition is a receiver of a signal, which is then displayed as sound, you go and whack that as hard as you can with a hammer, one of two things will happen. The sound will stop completely and all the lights will go off, or the sound will become extremely distorted. That's kind of what we're saying about the filter theory of the brain. It's not necessarily the producer of consciousness, but it is important in filtering consciousness into an experience that we understand it to be.
Yeah, the processing of it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know we can change that filter. We can alter it, we can modify it. I mean, there's been experiments where they would have people wear glasses that turned everything, upside down. But we wear that glasses enough, it flips it back up. The brain knows, for whatever reason, it wants to apprehend the universe. That's the mind apprehends the universe. And whether we understand that right now or not, doesn't change the fact that we've seen the mind do this. And that's one of the reasons why people study these things.
I just want to point out that you use the word brain and mind interchangeably. Yeah. You first said the brain wants to apprehend the universe, then you said the mind does. And I think
that's the very
I agree with you.
That's the very deep assumption.
The mind wants to apprehend the. I was just saying that the mind wants to apprehend. But I do think the brain is the hard mechanism by which that happens. I do think I personally right now I do tend to the mind is an emergent function of the brain, right? And I think the brain is a physical substrate. The mind is emergence. But again, that is just a philosophical position that could be changed on the fly.
Yeah. And it shows you how, despite the fact that the brain creates the mind is an assumption, it's so well fed into our culture that you kind of use them interchangeably without really thinking about it.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. Good catch.
Crystal Ignition says, a counter I've heard before is where doctors would place objects in the room that the patients would not see, but would see if they were floating above, like a matchbox in a closet. We've already gone through that one a bit back. Just go back and watch kind of the start of the video. Once it's done, we go through all that, and there's a reasonable explanation as to why. Usually it's down to sample size and people not being aware they're supposed to look for things when they're out of body. But yeah, it is a good question. It's always worth looking into it. I think that's it for questions so far.
And in fact, people interested in this, in the studies that have been done on this, in the book, The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, I wrote a chapter on apparently non-physical veridical perception, and it includes a review of each of the, at that time, 5 studies. Since then, Parnia has done his AWARE study, so there's now a 6th. And you can see how each study was done and what and as Darren said, that the results came up nil, and then a thorough discussion about all the factors to account for why it's so challenging to capture this phenomenon of veridical perception under controlled circumstances. It's really challenging.
And the near-death experience, mustn't forget, is one aspect of the idea of survival, which is kind of my main area of research, of survival after death, or what death even means. And there are so many different phenomena that you can always explain away the near-death experience if you can, and it'd be very difficult to, as we've tried to explain in this last 2 hours or so. But when it's taken collectively, all these experiences, that's where the evidence really comes from. And there's so many people, especially online, that will say there's no evidence of life after death. But it's not true. It really is not true. what they mean is they've never looked for it, or they've never seen anything that convinces them. If you go in with an open mind and being very kind of have an interest in it, you'll find that there's an incredible amount of evidence that you just wouldn't think of looking for, because why would you? But it's
and also be like if somebody said, look, there's no evidence of lucid dreaming. Well, I know firsthand that is not the case. I mean, people have studied this. Scientists have recognized it now. I mean,
that's right.
But at some point they probably would have said, there's no evidence of lucid dreaming. And scientists go, they don't exist. But once scientists recognize that people do this, they have actually sleep studies on it.
I'll tell you an interesting story that Dr. Harold Wallach told me. He's the author of a document called the Galileo Commission Report, which is part of the Scientific Medical Network, which is something, again, worth looking at because it highlights all the assumptions in science and why they kind of don't really work, as well as other things like the statistical significance of psi experiments, but that's another thing. But yeah, the Galileo Commission Report is worth looking. But he was telling me a very interesting idea of how the scientific community really works. Because according to him, and I don't know if this is 100% true, but taking it from him, I'd assume it must be, a long time ago, before the heart was realised as a pump, people thought it acted as a convection heater. And because of this strong assumption, nobody, when they were listening to the heart, when they decided it must be maybe a pump, no one could hear the heartbeat. They couldn't feel the heartbeat, they couldn't hear the heartbeat, because they were so sure that it wasn't a pump that they couldn't actually hear the heartbeat. And it was only when that idea was pushed more and more that people actually started to be able to detect that heartbeat and actually feel it. And it seems amazing that an idea can be so strong that it seems to lose your ability to sense things. And I don't know how true that is, but from Dr. Harold Wallach, I'd assume that there is reasonable truth in it. Tom, I think NDEs are a product of our brain. Sorry, yeah, they may well be. I don't think they are, but it depends on your take of the evidence. And Leo, from you too.
What you just described, Darren, reminds me of the research that I know has been done, in which some indigenous people cannot perceive a photograph. The idea of a three-dimensional world being represented on a two-dimensional object, it just doesn't compute. And so
it took me a long time to actually finally see those images. I know exactly what you're talking about. And the first time you actually see one of those three-dimensional images in a two-dimensional representation, and you actually see the full image, you're like, wow, it really does. But it's really difficult to get your brain to do that because the brain's not used to looking at things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So it really is interesting how our expectations and our experiences can in the material domain can limit our capacity to perceive. Yeah.
A good example in the chat from Leo Phyllis says, near-death experiences are emphasised a product of physical brain, full stop. Now that, Leo, this is what you'd call an opinion. That's not science. There is, a lot of evidence to suggest the contrary, and it's, you're entitled to your opinion. That's fine, but that's
it's actually unknown in both philosophy.
It's completely unknown. Yeah. And
I would say it's unknown.
And to state something as emphatically as that with emphasis doesn't make it the case.
Now we can all say it is a fact that everybody has a brain if they're conscious, and there's light of what they would call what do they call it? I forget. This brain reactivity. Then obviously we'd probably say there's a mind, but we all agree that we have to have a mind. We all have to have a brain. I just did it again. As you pointed out, we use these terms often interchangeably. We shouldn't. But we all have to have a physical brain in order to have life. That is something that is a fact, biologically speaking, philosophically speaking. Those are the things where we can say full stop. But I think when you're dealing with philosophy of mind, we don't have a clue. I mean, it's just we don't know. I mean, we're just guessing, and we're trying to figure it out. And so I don't think it makes sense to say, look, the mind is strictly, some kind of a function of the brain. Sure, you go as that as a precept, but I would not state it as some kind of just demonstrated fact. No.
And here's another kind of mysterious thing that we haven't touched on yet, and that's electromagnetic after effects of near-death experiences.
Yeah.
So there's this phenomenon where originally in the early near-death research, people were reporting, anecdotally, that near-death experiencers would report like walking down the street past several streetlights, and as they would approach each streetlight, it would go out, and when they passed it, it would go back on, and then the next one would go out, and that sort of thing. If you've ever seen the Jimmy Durante, that's probably too old for a lot of you.
I know who Durante was.
Yeah, and he used to do an entry thing where
cha-cha-cha. So what did he used to say?
So, pardon?
What did Durante used to say? Ha-cha-cha-cha or something.
Ha-cha-cha.
Yeah, ha-cha. Well, I'm giving away my age here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So they also reported that mechanical or electrical things malfunctioned in their presence. Computers would crash. A lot of near-death experiencers can't wear a wristwatch because the battery dies within a week or two. They'll put in a new battery. It dies within a week or two, and finally they just give up. And they didn't have these problems before their NDE. They only had them after. So there have been two independent studies, questioning people who had a close brush with death where they didn't remember a near-death experience, a close brush with death where they did remember a near-death experience, and then didn't remember ever having come close to death, and answer questions about how often electrical things malfunction in their presence. And so if you think about the people who have never come close to death, they report malfunctions at this level, just a few every once in a while. If you've come close to death without an NDE, it bumps up a little bit, but not significantly, not statistically significantly. If you had an NDE, it's like this. There's a statistically significant increase in malfunction. And so it's just kind of an interesting mystery about how, having had this experience of consciousness functioning apart from the physical body and then returning to the physical body, that there is some kind of energetic emanation of some kind that seems to interfere electrically around the person. I remember a gal I interviewed one time, and she was saying, "Oh, this explains." She was living with her boyfriend. They got a new TV. And he would complain that whenever she was in the room, the TV volume would go up and down. It would switch channels, and nobody was touching the remote. And he said, it only happens when you're in the room. Well, yeah, because she's a near-death experiencer. That's what happens with a lot of NDEers. So what is going on there? We don't know. But we know that it happens. We don't know what the mechanism is or how it happens. But there's something physical that's manifesting from an experience, from a phenomenological experience.
Derek, can I take what Leo said? Can I address that real quick? Yes, I know you want to. You're biting at the bit too. I know you are. But Leo said, and I think this is what I would categorize was called an argument to ignorance.
That's a good point.
And I love Leo. Don't get me wrong. But Leo, he says, there's no study that concludes these experiences are natural processes. There's no study that concludes, quote, these experiences aren't natural processes of the brain. There are also no studies that conclude that aliens do not exist or that they do exist. These are unknowns, right? And so when a lot of these studies, they actually will say, we don't know. We don't have an answer. So we wouldn't have an expectation to say these experiences are not natural processes of the brain. That's not the point. The point is that there are certain things that are anomalous that requires further investigation. But when you say something along the lines of like, oh, aliens do not exist, full stop. Why? Well, because no study has ever concluded that aliens exist. Well, that's by definition an argument from ignorance. Darren, do you want to touch on that?
Well, I was going to just say, the scientific method is effectively trying to prove something wrong. There aren't peer-reviewed studies on aliens, are there? I don't know, but there certainly are on near-death experiences and reasonable ones. I mean, Dr. Jan here's you've been specially awarded, haven't you, for your research activities in an N1, R1 or something university, which is the highest level of research university. So I saw your comment comparing us to creationists earlier. We're certainly not quite in that spectrum, but Leo, that's just that sort of definite statement is completely the opposite of what science is, and it's really not helpful. And you see it a lot amongst those who believe, honestly, that what they're doing is critical thinking. And I've been accused many times of not showing critical thinking. I can assure you that I do, in every possible sense.
I try to be as objective as possible, and I give principle charity, and you do as well. I've noticed that. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to have a longer conversation. We've talked in the past, but I noted about you. You do really want to critically analyze things, and you want to know what the actual verticality is. You want to know what the truth is.
Yeah,
and I think that's important.
I mean, the thing about it's good to be skeptical, right? And the problem I find, especially with the online louder skeptics, is they are very skeptical of any idea that goes against what they believe. They're not so good at being skeptical that perhaps they are incorrect themselves.
But that's not really skepticism. No, I mean, it's certainly not in any philosophical sense. But that to me is just hyper doubt.
But the point is that there are so many of these skeptics online that people follow, and they therefore believe that they themselves are skeptical because they do the same things that these other guys do. But that, unfortunately, you've had a shield covered over your eyes, because that isn't skepticism. That's just non-practical. That's not how science works, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Do you remember back when about the virtue of doubt? People were trying to say that doubt is a virtue, and I was giving much pushback to various communities on that because they didn't understand, one, what a virtue was in any kind of real sense, in virtue ethics or any kind of Aristotelian sense. But a virtue is something that you want to always try to, aspire to, and doubt is not. Doubt is a tool. Don't get me wrong. Doubt can be useful, but doubt can actually be detrimental as well. And I think a lot of the people on some of these communities that are trying to promote their brand of skepticism TM do not really get that. They really think that just, I doubt this, or I don't believe you without sufficient evidence is what actual skepticism is about. It's not. Sure, it's definitely healthy not to take anything at face value. Look, if Darren says, "Hey, Steve, I was abducted by aliens last night," I'm like, "Oh, really? I'm not quite convinced to this. Let's talk about it." Right? That's a healthy thing. But this is called ordinary doubt.
That's right.
Right? And so I think a lot of people just mistake ordinary doubt that most rational people should have with this weird narrative. Oh, I'm being skeptical. Well, no, you're not. When you people be so dismissive by fiat, then they're not really trying to even incorporate anything that could ever change their paradigmatic thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I hear someone be that adamant about their opinion, I wonder how much they've actually looked at the evidence, and it would be different for someone who's looked at the evidence and can really account for it through a materialist explanation. But most of the people, not all, but most of the people I know who have looked at the evidence critically have come pretty much to the place that Darren is at, which is tending to believe that there is that consciousness is essentially not seated in the brain, that there is survival, that there was existence of consciousness prior to birth, and it will continue to exist after our physical death. And as is typical of people who have reached the most advanced level of critical thinking, there's a specific reflective judgment. Darren is saying, I'm still open to other, to new information, but this is based on everything I know. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with reflective judgment theory. This is Kitchener and King's decades of research about how people come to their opinions on what are ambiguous problems that can't just be answered with some, factual information, like, is abortion right, and is there a survival of consciousness after death, and those kinds of things. And they found that people go through a developmental sequence, and their first position is what they call non-reflective or pre-reflective, and that is that they have attached themselves to some expert, whether it's a book, a person, or some combination of external authority, who has voiced a particular opinion, and they attach themselves to that. And so it's like they haven't considered the alternatives yet. And then the next level is where they've begun to look at the alternatives, and they see that, oh, wait a minute, there are valid points of view over here that are different, and this one's different, and this one's different. So they're in this quasi-reflective. They've started really looking at the evidence and finding that there is more than one valid point of view. But they're often lost in a mire of relativism because they haven't yet learned how to privilege some of the, some evidence is better than other. And that even something that can look good at first, when you look at it more carefully, it's like, maybe not so much. And so the quasi-reflective people see the validity of different points of view, but they haven't yet evaluated the evidence enough to privilege some of that evidence over others. At the most advanced level, I guess, is reflective judgment, where the person has evaluated all the evidence, and then they have privileged some, seeing some having better value than other, and come to what I like to call your current best answer. And the difference between that one answer and the first answer, which was pre-reflective, is having looked at all that evidence and weighed it and come to this position, and plus the fact that the pre-reflective position is staunch. It's a statement in capital letters that excludes any other point of view. The current best answer is this is where I'm at right now based on everything I know, and I might change my mind as more evidence comes in. So it's a somewhat more fluid. So it's solid but still changeable. And
I'm sorry, I thought you did. No, by all means, please. What you're saying is very, very reminiscent of epistemological considerations for how we determine knowledge. Dewey would be a big part of that kind of a paradigm where you, for example, on certain stages of epistemological certainty, some people say, well, to have knowledge, you have to have epistemic certainty. But of course, most people go what's called a weak case of knowledge that doesn't require certainty. So when we reflect upon how we formulate our beliefs, that goes very much into, I think, what you're kind of talking about. Was it
Kitchener and King?
Yes, Kitchener. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not the exact term you said it. I'm not familiar with, but it sounds exactly like what I would say relating to how we make decisions and how do we come across our belief formalizations.
Yeah. And so it can be helpful in hearing people's points of view to be able to understand where they're coming from in terms of their level of reflective judgment. And as Darren said, there's a great deal of evidence from other areas. In fact, I believe that near-death experiences alone do not provide evidence of survival of consciousness after death, because everybody who reports a near-death experience didn't ever stay dead. And we don't know what happens when you stay dead. From a purely scientific point of view, NDEers cannot tell us what happens when you stay dead. Maybe there's some temporary something somehow that then fizzles out. We can't tell from NDEs. But if you also look at the convergence of evidence from research on things like past life memories, mediumship, and what little research there is on after-death communication right now, it points more solidly towards survival of consciousness.
See, I would love to have a follow-up on that one day. I will tell you, I am very anti-mediumship. I'm straight up anti-mediumship. But again, after looking at a lot of things and not just, saying, hey, I just by fiat say it's wrong. I actually have looked at, countless hours of footage from many mediums over the years. Sylvia Brown and the Long Island Medium, Darren Edwards, who's actually a very good one, but he does it in a very scientific way, right? He actually explains why some of these things seem like they're like actually mediumships when they're not. But I think that, to me, I don't think mediums exist. Matter of fact, I will say mediums, I think, are frauds, basically. But I think that's a huge different topic.
A lot of them are. Although there have been studies done, most notable one by Julie Byshell of the Windbridge Institute, that have been double, triple, quintuple, whatever, blinded, which still yielded positive results. I don't know about mediumship. I've been to a few, and I've heard enough anecdotes from people I know and people that I've seen where the accuracy was such that you really do need to consider there's no possible.
Well, I can tell you this: if there is a such thing as a medium or something that does communicate with some kind of consciousness that lives on after death, which, by the way, is a presupposition that it is a consciousness that we're talking to that is after death, whether it never had any kind of existence. But sure, but I will definitely say without equivocation that any medium that's ever been on any kind of TV or any kind of show or anything like that, I'm absolutely convinced every one of them is fraud.
Yeah, I don't tend to base my opinions on people who've been on TV. I base them on research. As Darren said, the Windbridge Institute they've conducted some really careful investigations. And then, as Darren mentioned earlier, and we maybe should shine a little bit more light on this, experience is everything. Until I had experiences of mediumship, I'm not talking about going to a medium. I'm talking about something happened with me that I was the medium. And I didn't have any idea what the image that I was getting meant. But when I conveyed it to the person for whom it was seemingly intended, they burst into tears and explained the meaning of it. And that experience was very evidential for me. I wasn't seeking it. It's what I call spontaneous mediumship, where it happens uninvited, unexpected, unanticipated. And so, but it opened the door for me to consider that the phenomenon could be genuine in some cases. And I certainly don't disagree that there are people who are frauds, and that even people who have some abilities, the abilities are not, you just can't turn it on and off. And but they may feel pressured, so sometimes they may use strategies other than genuine communication to get what they're getting. So, and I think, just to step back a little bit, this thing of direct experience is really important. Ken Wilber talks about levels of development, and he says that the first 7 years we're in the pre-personal mode, where knowledge is acquired purely through the senses. And then around age 7, we develop the capacity to reason. So between 7 and at least age 21, we're in the personal domain, and rationality dominates, and the ability to think abstractly and so forth. And then beginning around age 21, but for some people it never happens, is the potential to move into the trans personal domain, and that in that domain, knowledge is transrational. And for people who've never experienced that, they just can't get it. It's like trying to ask a 3-year-old to reason. They just can't do it. And so, so having experience in the transrational domain, to me, seems like a big factor. In my experience, it's been a big factor in a person's even openness to consider that such a domain even exists. And
Absolutely.
Certainly we get lots of cases of, especially I love the cases of physicians who were just schooled and completely immersed in materialist philosophy until they had a near-death experience. And I'll never forget when Eben Alexander spoke the first time publicly about his near-death experience. I happened to be there. And he said, you know, here I am, this Harvard neurosurgeon with all these publications. And before my NDE, I thought I knew pretty much everything there was to know about the brain and consciousness. Now I take all that knowledge, and it's this much in a vast universe. And my near-death experience opened me to that. I never would have dreamed it. And so, experience is really important. And I don't know what to do about that. The fact that, you know, even openness to the topic is dependent on experience, and experience, you know, it's outside of my control to make happen.
Yeah. Dr. Alexander's one I spoke with as well, and Leo's just on cue there with his, oh God, Eben Alexander is a fraud.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I've spoken with
So
Dr.
again,
and
you know, I really invite those of you who think that to access the Journal of Near-Death Studies. And I don't have the volume and all that, but I can get it and convey it if anybody's interested, of an article in which his the person who wrote an article discrediting Alexander in the Atlantic magazine, that article is critiqued by some NDE researchers, I think, very effectively, and really showing that there was even some, you know, like whatever in journalism is called malpractice, you know, in representing his story.
The article that was written in what journal was it? I can't remember exactly which one it was, but I spoke with Dr. Eben Alexander for my podcast, and I was careful that I brought up that subject because he's, as you say, he's had a lot of stick about his apparent malpractice in the past. And it was Luke Dittrich wrote it.
Yes.
I can't remember in which journal it was, but he wrote it. And
it was in the Atlantic. I think it was the Atlantic Monthly or something like that.
There was the original. I keep thinking of it. Esquire. It was in Esquire.
Esquire. You're right. It was Esquire.
And I made sure I brought that up with Dr. Alexander because not many people seem to, and it's the thing, people know about the Esquire article, but they don't know about the rebuttal to that. And again, you must look at both to understand exactly what's going on. And, you know, there's cases in that Esquire article where people have been misrepresented, assumptions have been made, and it's really worth looking at both. You know, don't just look at the rebuttal and take our word for it that he's not a fraud. Look at all the claims and come to your own decision, but be sure to look at it fairly.
I will say this. I think personal experience is important. Matter of fact, the next episode we do on Agree to Argue is that very topic, is personal experience persuasive to other people. I do think, Dr. Holden, you have experienced these things. There's no question in my mind. And this is the difference between a lot of the these communities, they would just hyper doubt. Oh, she's lying. She didn't experience these things. It's that kind of attitude. I give a lot more principled charity. I absolutely, am fine with saying I do think that you have experienced these things. I've experienced things that I cannot relate to other people. So if I have, probably you have as well. I think that's a very, very charitable interpretation. But I think it all boils down to these are still things that are unknown. We don't know why. We don't know why maybe spontaneous mediumship happens. Do I believe that is a communication with the dead? No. But if we could determine that would be the case, that would be completely awesome. But I don't think that is the case. But I do think there is an explanation, probably. I'm not a huge fan of the principle of sufficient reason, but I do think that in this case, why we experience things that we attribute to maybe kind of a supernatural or paranormal experience has some kind of underlying reason. What that reason is, straight up, I have no idea.
If we want to kind of wrap it up, I would like to, if maybe Jan would be interested in coming back and maybe discussing things like terminal lucidity and some of these other phenomena, because I think they again, it all kind of converges into a group of evidence as opposed to one phenomena. But I think a good way to finish it off is to say that, you know, the physical idea of materialism is very good and it works very well for our day-to-day life. However, when you do serious research into this area of phenomena relating to anomalous experience, and you do it openly, you will find that there is more than enough evidence to suggest that our model of the brain and its interaction or creation of consciousness is incomplete, and maybe that the emergence theory does not parsimoniously explain all of the data. And if you approach it purely from a scientific way, a truly scientific way, I think it can be in no doubt that perhaps there is something going on that we don't really understand, and maybe it is a piece or a form of nature that operates in a different way. You know, you can call it non-physical, you can call it spiritual, you can call it godly, but regardless, something is certainly going on that warrants further investigation, and in a serious, non-judgmental fashion. And the standard ridicule that you hear is to be expected on any kind of paradigm shift, but it's not productive. And we must be honest with ourselves that we don't understand everything. We don't understand a percentage of everything. You know, the universe and creation is so huge that anything really is possible, and evidence is suggesting that we really look into this a bit more. I think that's a reasonable way to wrap it up.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Sounds good.
I mean, do you mind quickly if I plug my own stuff?
By all means.
I mean, I don't do it for any kind of popularity. It's my own research that I'm doing it mainly for. That's why I'll save everything. But if anybody's interested in this sort of thing, you know, my YouTube channel and Facebook group and blog is called Seeking Eye. It's just looking at this kind of stuff, mainly life after death, but any phenomena relating to it and any kind of social things that I want to put my 2 cents across on. Did one about gender today, and I was really umming and ahhing whether to do that one. But I decided to risk it and go for it. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you know, just pop over to Seeking Eye. I'd love to have you there.
And I just want to thank the people that came in to listen to this. If you guys want more of this stuff, let me know in the comments. This is, again, what I like to have on my channel, these kinds of discussions. So I'm thrilled to death that Darren had arranged this over. It's been a couple of months, I guess, with Dr. Holden. So, I mean, because of time elements and weird things that are happening, and, you know, 2020 kind of can't plan on anything. But I'm definitely doing a lot more stuff like this on my show. Preliminary stuff, obviously, until we get back on Sequitur show. But Dr. Holden, this was fascinating. I do appreciate you very much coming in and answering, you know, these questions. And I don't have to agree with the people I have conversations with, but I love the fact when they do so, intellectually and honestly. That's the best I can ask for, and I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And is there anything you want to wrap it up on your end, Dr. Holden? What?
I've very much enjoyed this, and you know, beyond the seeking truth and just seeking accurate knowledge, there may be something at stake in terms of what we conclude about the nature of life and survival of consciousness after death and so forth. Near-death experiencers, many report that in their NDE, they experienced a life review. And in that experience, they reviewed and re-experienced and experienced being on the receiving end of everything they'd ever done. And whenever they had done something that had hurt someone or helped someone, they experienced being the recipient. They got what they had given. And so, what people come away with is an ethic about really doing unto others, not as you would have them do unto you, but as they are you. There is the separation that we perceive in this state of existence is real at this level, and it's also not real at another level. And that what I do to you, I do to myself. And so, there may be something at stake about, drawing conclusions about this. And some people could be going through life missing something really important, an important operating principle. So one of the things I like about our exchange today is that we exercise, even though that wasn't our explicit intention, we still exercise that principle. We listened to each other and heard each other's points of view, didn't always agree, but always treated each other with respect. And I've really valued that and appreciate this. And thank you both for this great experience.
Thank you as well.
And also nice to meet you all, everyone in the chat. I suppose that's necessary.
Yeah, good to meet you.